Chapter IPRVOBYBNOT Community Building in the Territory of our Country. 1. The oldest human society. The beginning of human society. The first traces of human existence in Europe belong to a very remote era, when it was dominated by a warm and humid climate. In the thick evergreen forests of Lavra, boxwood, yew and other trees and along the banks of rivers lived animals that are now either extinct, an ancient elephant, a rhinoceros of a particular breed, or found in southern countries, leopard. People lived in small groups, primitive horde. The first tools of man were roughly processed stones. People together gathered for food: snails, insects, fruits and edible roots. The hunting of the small beast was still of an accidental nature. Thanks to the warm climate, people did not need any special shelter or clothing to protect themselves from the cold. Gradually came a cold snap. The climate became more humid. In the north, large glaciers formed, which slid down from the mountains. The lush forests retreated to the south, and together with them a part of the animals migrated to the south. Some animals died out. The glaciers covered vast spaces. The man learned to use fire and stayed to live in new, more severe climatic conditions. At first, man only kept the fire, and then began to extract it by rubbing dry pieces of wood or carving sparks from the stone. Fire warmed man, protected him from animals and allowed to cook more nutritious, boiled meat and fish food. Ancient human settlements in our country are found in the Caucasus and in the Crimea. In caves near Simferopol, a large number of chopped animal bones were found together with rough stone tools. In these places there were sites of primitive hunters who used natural caves to protect themselves from animals and shelter from the weather. During the greatest glaciation, the powerful ice cover on the European territory of our country reached the middle course of the Don and the lower reaches of the Dnieper. In Siberia, the glaciation was less significant. For many tens of thousands of years the ice sheet has been lying in our country. Melting of the glaciers was slow, but gradually the boundary of the ice retreated to the north, leaving on the liberated territory a ridge of boulders. The earth, liberated from the glaciers, first represented the tundra. Frozen water streams formed river systems. The abundance of moisture led to the development of grass and forest cover. Steppes, forests and banks of water bodies were inhabited by large animals. Mammoths, rhinoceroses, deer and other representatives of the northern and polar fauna. In the mountains and caves live the most dangerous enemies of man: the cave lion, the cave bear and the cave hyena. Following the retreating glacier to the north, a man advanced. Primitive community. Using cudgels, sharpened sticks and the simplest stone tools, a man could not alone fight the harsh conditions of nature and predatory animals. At every step he was in danger. Only by helping each other, people could defend themselves from the attack of animals and get the right food. Especially necessary was mutual assistance in hunting large animals: mammoth, rhinoceros, wild bulls, etc. Mammoth looked like an elephant, only bigger and stronger than him. The main means of defense for the mammoth was his huge curved upward tusks. Mammoth is an animal herbivore and was scary only during his pursuit. In order to master such a strong beast, people together arranged pens, waiting for prey near the watering hole or near steep cliffs. The common life of people led to the formation of a primitive community. Everything, except for some small items, belonged to the community. Private property did not yet exist. In the primitive community there were neither rich nor poor, there was no exploitation of man by man, there were no classes. Despite mutual assistance to each other, facilitating the acquisition of funds for life, people of this period had to spend a lot of work to maintain their existence. The man was still powerless before the phenomena of nature, had no experience, no skills in the work. To protect against winter cold, people have learned to build dugouts and huts. The remains of such a dwelling were discovered on the Don, near the village of Gagarino. The bottom of the hut formed a shallow oval pit, lined at the sides with large stone blocks and large bones. At the top were strengthened converging poles, covered with branches and skins of animals. Inside the hut were scattered bones of mammoth, rhinoceros, bull and various small animals. There were found also ornaments, teeth of small predators, shells, female figurines made of bone. Thanks to the development of Soviet archaeological science, over 200 sites of the oldest human society were discovered in our country, scattered in different parts of the southern half of the European territory, in the Altai Mountains, in western and eastern Siberia. This testifies to the deepest antiquity of human society in our country. 2. The maternal family. The emergence of a maternal gender. Due to changes in climatic conditions, the natural conditions began to change, gradually approaching the present. The fauna has changed. Large animals, mammoths, cave lions, have died out. The primitive community at first did not have a certain composition and easily disintegrated. Meanwhile, joint management of the economy required a lasting and permanent unification. However, people of that time did not know permanent marriage. Children were associated only with the mother. Therefore, the maternal family became a social unit. Several maternal families constituted the maternal family, whose members knew their ancestors only, on the female line. Adult men engaged mainly in hunting, women led households, procured food supplies, cooked food, made clothes, took care of the home. This economic role of women created her predominant position in the family and in the family. Kindred gave each other help and protection. If someone from another's kind has offended or killed a relative, then the whole race took revenge for the insulted or the killed. The members of the clan persecuted the offender until he was killed. This was the duty of blood revenge. To solve the most important issues, the whole family, both men and women, gathered. In the clan assemblies, the foremen or leaders were chosen and moved. For many thousands of years people have passed from generation to generation the skills they have acquired in the struggle for existence. The man learned how to make tools of various sizes and shapes from solid stone and bone, axes, hammers, knives, scrapers, chippers, cutters, spearheads, etc. People began polishing the surface of stone tools, which improved and facilitated their use. Very important was the appearance of the bow and arrow, with the help of which the hunters began to hit the beast at a distance. From clay people learned to make dishes. At first the vessels were made of wood, rods and skin. Then, to give them greater strength, the walls of wooden vessels began to be coated with clay. Even later, we moved on to the modeling of vessels from one clay. Finally, they began to use the potter's wheel. So there was pottery. The surface of the vessels was covered with ornaments, dimples, fir trees. From the weaving of baskets of twigs and reeds people switched to weaving fibers of wild plants. So there was a textile production. A rough, woven fabric was used for clothes, bags, etc. The economic activities of people became more complex and varied. In fishing, fiber networks woven from fibers began to be used. In hunting, the main weapon was spears, throwing darts, bow and arrows. During excavations, archaeologists sometimes find the bones of large predators with deep-sided flint arrowheads. From the harvesting of fruits, people moved to sowing grain and tuberose plants. The selected piece of land, usually in the river valley, was loosened by a pointed stick, hoe, and then barley, millet, and wheat were sown. So there was a simple hoe farming. Domestication of wild animals marked the beginning of cattle breeding. The first pet was a dog. In the northern regions, the reindeer was domesticated. Parking of tribal communities in our country. Throughout our country, from the shores of the Black Sea and the mountain valleys of Transcaucasia to the far north and from Belorussia to eastern Siberia, many sites of tribal communities have been found. On these materials, scientists restored the life of people of that distant era. In the forest belt of the northern half of the European territory, settlements were established on the banks of rivers and lakes. Each settlement belonged to a separate family and consisted of a small number of dugouts or huts. Inhabitants of it were engaged mainly in fishing and partly hunting. In some places, tribal settlements were located in groups, which indicates the emergence of tribal alliances. In the southern, steppe part, especially in the fertile river valleys, the main occupation of the population was hoe farming. An example of the primitive agricultural economy of this era can serve Tripoli culture, found for the first time near the village of Tripolya, near Kiev. The stands of the Tripolian culture are found in large numbers in the territory of Ukraine to the west of the Dnieper. The inhabitants of these sites chose places for settlements on the coastal elevation or on the slopes of ravines at the bottom of which the streams flowed. On a place prepared for habitation, people laid a layer of clay, which was then burned with bonfires. The walls of the house were constructed from pillars and rods smeared with clay. It turned out a large dwelling with several hearths inside, containing up to 100 or more people. Near the houses were sown wheat, barley and millet. To loosen the land used wooden hoes with stone tips. Large stone slabs and graters served for manual grinding of grain. A large number of clay animal figurines were found. These figures seem to have been given magical significance. They had to protect the domestic herd and promote its increase. Images of some domestic animals are found on vessels. Copper wares are rarely found in the sites of the Tripolian culture. Found molds for casting show that at least some of these products were manufactured on site. The wide distribution of metal products coincides with the time when the maternal family began to disintegrate. The most ancient images of a person on the territory of the USSR. Figurines made of stone, dense chalk. Kostenki, near Voronezh. 3. The father's kind. Development of cattle breeding. Domestication of wild animals was of great importance for the economy of the tribal communities. Possessing pets, people had a constant supply of food and did not depend on the results of hunting, which was not always successful. After the dogs and deer, in the north, other domestic animals appeared. Bulls, goats, sheep, pigs, horses. Gradually cattle breeding became the main branch of the economy. First cattle all year round was kept at the fodder near the settlements. Then they began to prepare hay for feed for the winter, and in the north, dried and chopped thin rods with leaves. For the winter, pets were pushed into the same premises where people lived. Then for the animals began to arrange special rooms, the cribs. Large herds of cattle could not stay in one place for long. Therefore, people began to move with livestock in search of unexhausted pastures. So in the vast steppe areas there was nomadic cattle breeding. Along with the development of cattle breeding, a dairy farm appeared, cheese and oil production began. People learned how to process animal hair, get threads out of it, and then warm fabrics, well protected from the cold. A loom was invented. Breeding of domestic animals allowed to use their force for loosening the land. This led to the emergence of the first arable tool in the form of a wooden plow. The plow was made from a tree trunk with a curved bough or rhizome, which were sharpened at the ends. The emergence of the paternal kind. Cattle breeding was the main occupation of men. This increased their importance in the economy. On the contrary, the work of women has lost its former significance. Men became owners of herds and property, which they inherited from their children. Therefore, kinship was no longer considered to be female, but male. The former maternal family disintegrated. He was replaced by his father's family, that is, by an alliance of relatives who were descended from a common ancestor, a man. The established custom of inheriting the father's property by his children led to the accumulation of wealth in the family. Rich families stood out from the clan community. As a result of all this, the decay of the primitive communal system began. Development of Copper-Bronze Culture. The time of development of the paternal family coincided with the time when stone products were replaced by copper and bronze. The native copper, which people found, was first subjected to forging in a cold state. However, items made of pure copper, or too soft, quickly tapered and easily bent. Therefore, the discovery of a copper alloy with tin, bronze, was of great importance for improving the quality of metal tools. Bronze melts at a lower temperature than copper. This made it easier for you to melt and make bronze objects. The use of bronze, which has a greater hardness than copper, has significantly improved tools and weapons. Human labor has become more productive, and its weapons, more perfect. The most ancient copper objects found in our country date back to the 3rd millennium BC. First they were imported from the southern and eastern countries. Not later than the 2nd millennium BC. There was also a local production of bronze products. The mountains of the Caucasus, Central Asia, Altai and the Urals became the centers of the bronze culture, which then spread in the steppe and forest areas. In ancient times, when hunting was the main occupation of people, there were no differences in the life of individual primitive communities. Subsequently, economic activities became more diverse. In the forest areas, abounding in wild animals, hunting has retained its former importance. Near the rivers and lakes people began to engage mainly in fishing. There appeared farming in the fertile river valleys. The grassy steppes have turned into pastures for cattle. Communities of farmers and pastoralists developed faster than hunter communities. Thus, the development of human society was uneven. In our country, these differences have increased markedly in the 2nd and especially in the 1st millennium BC. The inhabitants of the forest belt of the European territory and the vast forest areas of Siberia remained mainly hunters and fishermen. People here lived in small scattered settlements. They still had a primitive communal system. On the grass-covered plains of southern Siberia, Central Asia and the Black Sea region, cattle breeding was the main occupation. In the fertile valleys, agriculture developed. In these localities the decay of the primitive communal system took place more rapidly. In the southern steppes of the Black Sea region are scattered many mounds. When excavated they find human skeletons, painted in red. At the burial, the corpse of the deceased was covered with ochre or marmot, which then settled on the bones. Near the dead were placed weapons and various household items. Sometimes there are male and female skeletons in one burial ground. It can be assumed that it was a custom to kill a wife at the death of her husband, the head of the family, and bury her with him. Among these burial mounds there are rich and poor burials, indicating the appearance of property inequality. An example of particularly rich burials belonging to tribal leaders is the mound near the city of Myakop. He reached a height of 10 meters. In the main room of the grave was found the skeleton, painted with a reddish-red color. The dress was worn on the deceased, studded with gold ornaments, images of bulls, rings, rosettes, as well as gold, cornelian, turquoise beads and other small objects. Nearby there were gold and silver vessels. Above the corpse was built a canopy, resting on the golden and silver tubular struts, adorned with massive gold and silver figures of bulls. In the special sections of this grave there were 2 more skeletons. Along with the leader, the people close to him had to die. Bronze culture reached a flourishing in the 2nd millennium and the beginning of the 1st millennium BC. In the mountains of the Caucasus, Transcaucasia and Altai. Here, in many places, ancient mines were discovered, in which ore was extracted, which served as a material for local production of bronze. At the beginning of the 1st millennium BC, in the southern mountains of Transcaucasia and in Asia Minor began to form a class society. The beginning of the iron culture. In our country at the end of the 2nd millennium BC, appeared products of iron. First, iron was used as jewelry on bronze objects. In the first half of the first millennium BC, in different places there was already a production of iron products that began to displace military weapons and tools from bronze. Albania was located along the western shore of the Caspian Sea. In mountainous areas and in the lowland part of Albania there lived a large number of small tribes, each of which was ruled by its princes. These tribes often attacked the neighbors, Iberians, Georgians and Armenians. Subsequently, they united under the leadership of the strongest tribe of Albanians. On behalf of this tribe, the then-known name of the country, Albania, took place. The descendants of the population of ancient Albania subsequently joined the Azerbaijani nationality. 5. Peoples of the northern Black Sea region until the 4th century of the New Era. Scythians. The population that occupied in the 3 centuries BC, steppe spaces from the Volga to the Dniester, was called one common name, the Scythians. In fact, the Scythians consisted of different tribes, among which were pastoralists and farmers. All of them were united under the power of strong nomadic tribes, who gave their name to the entire population of the northern Black Sea steppes. The stories of Greek writers draw the life of a nomadic Scythian. All the property of the Scythian was placed in a 4-wheeled or 6-wheel trolley harnessed by 2 or 3 pairs of oxen. Each tent was a felt house, in which women and children were housed. With themselves the Scythians drove the herds of horses, flocks of sheep and cows. In one place, the Scythians remained until the grass was enough to feed the cattle. After that, they moved to a new pasture. Among the masses of nomads stood a rich nobility, who owned large herds and herds. Cattle breeding was serviced by slaves. The Scythians were distinguished by great militancy, endurance, courage and cruelty to their enemies. From the skulls of the dead, they made cups for wine, and tattered skin was used to make quivers. The greatest honor was a brave warrior. Every year a feast was held, on which only those who killed the enemies drank wine from the common cup. Each tribe had its own king, who had great power. When the king was dying, his corpse, put on a cart, was taken all over the country. Residents, meeting the corpse of the king, had to express deep sorrow. They cut their hair, cut off part of their ear, scraped their faces, pierced their left arm with an arrow. The kings were buried in large mounds. Together with them, they instilled weapons, silver and gold dishes, a large number of dead horses. Together with the king, his wife and servants were buried. In the south of our country and now among the steppes there are large Scythian mounds reaching 10-12 meters of height. A silver vase from Chernomlitz Kurgan. The Hermitage, Leningrad. Many of them are excavated. The wonderful things found in them adorned the collections of our museums. During the excavation of the Great Chernomlitsky Mound, near the city of Nikopol on the Dnieper, a magnificent silver vase decorated with images from the life of the nomadic Scythians was found. On these images we see fishing and domestication of wild horses. First, 2 horses are presented, grazing in freedom in the steppe. In another scene, the Scythians struggle to keep the wild horse caught. Then 3 Scythians are depicted, who are trying to knock the horse to the ground. Finally, the horse is shown after domestication. The bent Scythian connects her front legs. No less interesting is the golden vase found in the barrow near Kerch, on Mount Koloba. In one of the depicted scenes, the seated Scythian, apparently the leader, listens to the story or reports of the warrior. The leader's long hair was intercepted by a bandage. His clothes consist of a short kaftan with a belt and trousers. With both hands, the leader leans against a long spear. The warrior sits before the king, kneeling. Then the skiff is drawn, pulling the string on the bow. Behind him, a Scythian touches a tooth from another with a finger. Finally, 2 Scythians are depicted, one of which binds a sick or wounded leg to another. On the head, some Scythians wear pointed bashlets. On the side of all are brought quivers with arrows and gaunts, cases for bows. In one of the mounds, Saloka, was found a golden crest, apparently belonging to some Scythian king. 2. History of the USSR for 8 cells. 17. Gold vase from Kaloba. Hermitage. The upper part of the crest represents the scene of the Battle of 3 Warriors, 2 foot soldiers, one of whom, no doubt, the Scythian, attacked the Greek rider. Greek settlements in the Black Sea and the Caucasus coast. By the time the Scythians dominated the southern steppes, the Greeks settled the shores of the Black Sea. At first the Greeks had very little information about these lands. Fantastic stories about the population of the Black Sea region have been preserved, and some Greek legends about the Golden Fleece, about the wanderings of Odysseus, etc. The first Greeks who visited these shores were fishermen and traders who exchanged with local residents. Since 7th century BC, on the shores of the Black Sea, permanent Greek colonies began to emerge. In the estuary of the southern Bug and the Dnieper, a colony of Albia arose, not far from present Sevastopol, Kherson, on the southeastern coast of the Crimea, Feodosia and Panticapaeum, now Kerch, at the confluence of the Don to the Azov Sea, Tanas was built. Greek settlements also appeared on the Caucasian coast, Phocis, near the mouth of the Rhine, Dioscuriad, now Sukhumi, etc. The center of every Greek colony was a city surrounded by a stone wall that protected the colonists from attack from hostile populations. Inside the city wall were houses, warehouses and various public buildings, temples, baths, etc. Among the buildings were beautiful works of Greek architecture, decorated with marble columns and statues. For the Greek Black Sea colonies, trade with Greece, with the eastern countries and with the peoples of Eastern Europe was of great importance. The ships that sailed to Greece were loaded with bread, slaves, furs and fish. From Greece brought weapons, fabrics, dishes made of clay and glass, expensive jewelry and luxury goods, wine. Part of the imported goods met the needs of the upper layer of the local Greek population, part of the goods were in exchange for bread and other products supplied by the population of the northern Black Sea coast. Subsequently, in the Greek cities originated their own handicraft production. From the workshops of the Black Sea colonies came out many items found in Scythian barrows. The free Greek population in the colonies, as well as in Greece, gathered for people's congregations to discuss various issues and the choice of officials. All management was in the hands of rich slave owners and merchants. Each city colony was a separate state. One of them, Panticapaeum, united under his authority a significant territory, which received the name of the Bosporus Kingdom. At its head stood the kings who handed over power by inheritance from father to son. Since the end of the 3rd century BC, the position of the Greek colonies in the Black Sea region began to deteriorate. In the near Caspian steppes, tribes of nomad Sarmatians, related to Scythians appeared. Under the pressure of the Sarmatians, part of the Scythians and other nomads moved westward and reached the Danube. Another part of the Scythians moved to the Crimea and occupied its northern steppe part. The Scythians, remaining in the former places, mingled with the Sarmatians and other tribes. Greek cities with difficulty fought off the attacks of nomads. Set in Crimea, the Scythians in the 2 BC, often attacked Chersonese and the Bosporan kingdom. At this time on the southern coast of the Black Sea, in Asia Minor, the Pontic state was formed. Chersonesus, who had no opportunity to defend himself on his own, concluded a treaty of assistance with the Pontus king. Rise of slaves in the Crimea. At the end of the 2nd century BC, there was an uprising of the Scythian slaves in the Bosporan state. The slave of the Bosporan king Savmak killed the king and became the leader of the insurgents. The uprising was suppressed by the commander of the Pontus king Mithridates Pater Diophantus, who arrived in Chersonese to protect him from the Scythians. He captured Savmak and sent him to Mithridates in Asia Minor. In gratitude for help against the Scythians, the rulers of Chersonesos put a bronze statue of Diophantus in full arms in the Acropolis, Kremlin of the city near the altar of the most revered goddess. On the marble pedestal of the statue, they carved an inscription about the merits and victories of Diophantus. This inscription was found among the ruins of Chersonesos. The uprising of slaves in the Crimea was not a single one. Similar mass uprisings of slaves occurred in the 2 centuries BC, in many other slave states, in Asia Minor, Greece, Italy, the island of Sicily and elsewhere. These uprisings of slaves pointed to the beginning of the disintegration of the slave society. Roman conquests in the Black Sea region. In the ICBC, the possessions of Rome quickly spread to the east. To conquer Asia Minor, Rome needed to defeat the Pontic state and Armenia. For nearly 18 years, the struggle between Rome and the Pontus king Mithridates I continued. Finally, the Roman legions inflicted a heavy defeat on Mithridates I and invaded the territory of Tigran II. They plundered the rich capital of Armenia, the city of Tigranocerta on the Tigris River, but then they began to fail. Then the commander of Pompeii was sent against the Tigran II with new legions. Together with the Armenians, Georgians, Medes and other nations fought against the Romans. Pompey, taking advantage of the strife among the Armenian nobility, forced Tigran II to make peace. The Armenian king received the title of friend and ally of the Roman people, which meant submission to Rome. Then the Romans subjugated a significant part of Georgia. In the ICBC, the Romans firmly established themselves in the Black Sea region. The Bosporan kings became vassals of the Roman emperors and obediently obeyed their orders. In Chersonesus and other Greek cities of the Crimea and the Caucasus, Roman legions were located. On the Black Sea coast, Roman fortresses were built, from the towers of which were observed the appearance of enemy ships. Coined with the image of Scythian Scythian wagon, a clay toy from the Scythian mound. Decree of the People's Assembly of Chersonesos in honor of Diophantus. The kings of Bosporus began to call themselves names of Roman emperors and wear Roman clothes. They received from Rome signs of power, the scepter with the image of the emperor and the royal crown. Over many centuries of the existence of the Greek colonies, the descendants of the former colonists mingled with the local population. Former people, belonging to different tribes, settled in the coastal cities and were part of their citizens. So in the Crimea there was a mixture of different cultures. With the weakening of the Roman Empire, Roman influence in the Black Sea countries fell sharply. Roman fortresses in the Crimea and the Caucasus coast to the 3 emptied. The former Greek cities again became independent. In the 3rd century, in the southern steppes of the Black Sea region a new tribal union was formed, known as the Reti. Among them were the Eastern Germans, who used to live along the lower course of the Vistula. From the middle of the 3rd century, Goths began to invade the Roman possessions located beyond the Danube. At the same time Gothic pirates plundered the Caucasian and Asian coast of the Black Sea, made their way to the Aegean Sea and burned Greek cities. In the IV century, the Romans inflicted a heavy defeat on the Goths. Attacks prepared for the Eastern Roman possessions were the beginning of the struggle against the Romans of different tribes of Eastern Europe. At the same time in the west of Europe there was a struggle between the Romans and the Germanic tribes. Attacks of barbarians, not Romans, accelerated the death of the slave-holding Roman state. 6. Movement of nomads. Nomadic associations in Siberia and Central Asia. The vast steppe spaces of South Siberia and Central Asia were occupied by various nomadic tribes, from which later the Turkic and Mongolian peoples were formed. For several centuries BC, nomads who lived north of China, formed a large tribal alliance. The Chinese called the nomads who were part of this union Huns. The struggle of the Chinese against the Huns was very difficult and lasted for centuries. Nomads unexpectedly attacked the northern lands of China, destroyed cities, destroyed crops and took with them the population. When a large Chinese army was gathering, the nomads went back to the steppe and scattered over its vast spaces. To protect the border, The Chinese were still in the 3rd century BC. Built strong stone fortifications, known as the Great Wall of China. Gradually the Chinese influence began to penetrate the nomads. The head of the nomadic power of the Huns took the title of Born of Heaven and Earth, set by the sun and the moon. The princes of the Huns sent their sons to serve at the court of the Chinese emperor. The dominant layer of nomads began to adopt Chinese customs and Chinese clothing. In the richest burial mounds, burials of the Hunnish leaders, investigated by the Soviet expedition of P.K. Kozlov in northern Mongolia, chariots, Chinese silks, a luxurious carpet depicting a winged animal, tormenting moose, jewelry, honorable umbrellas and other objects were found. In the ICBC, the great power of the Huns disintegrated. Part of the Huns left to the west. In the steppes of Asia, where the tribes of the Huns used to rule, new tribes emerged, formerly under their rule. The Turkic Khaganate. In the VI.Ne in Mongolia formed an association of tribes, known under the name of the Turkic Khaganate. The leader of this power was called Khagan. Under the rule of the Khaganate there were a large number of nomadic and partly agricultural tribes. The ruling tribes, led by the Khagan, constantly raided their neighbors and spread their power over a vast territory. The noble and wealthy men commanded detachments and ruled the conquered tribes. The bulk of the nomadic population lived in separate clan communities. In the valley of the river Orkhon, tombstones of Turkic Khagans with carved inscriptions on large campaigns and other most outstanding events have been preserved. The Turkic Khagans were at enmity with the Kyrgyz, Khakas, who lived in the upper Yenisei and in the Altai Mountains. One of the inscriptions tells how the Turk Khagan sat on a white stallion and went with his army to the Kyrgyz. In the battle he threw one Kyrgyz from his horse. With the spear in his hands he crashed into the ranks of enemies. At the same time he so strongly spurred the white stallion that broke his ribs. Khan Kyrgyz was killed, and the people obeyed the power of the Turkic Khagan. The power of the Turks in Mongolia and Central Asia broke up in the 8th century. After the fall of the Turkic Khaganate, the most powerful were the Kyrgyz, Khakas. The Kyrgyz were a large people and could expose up to 80,000 soldiers. Thus, for many centuries in the vast expanses of southern Siberia and Central Asia, then the associations of nomads were created and disintegrated. The movement of nomads, who sought the best pastures and prey, covered most of the Central Asian steppes. Part of the nomads settled in new places, part moved further to the west. A good bait for them was the fat grassy steppes, lying in a continuous cover to the northwest of the Caspian Sea. Invasion of nomads in Eastern Europe. Nomadic tribes that appeared in the late 4th century, near the Sea of Azov, became known in Europe under the general name of Huns. After the power of the Huns in Mongolia disintegrated, some tribes that were part of this power, fleeing from the Chinese, migrated to the west. A few centuries later, their descendants, mixed on the way with other peoples, appeared in Eastern Europe. Contemporaries called the Huns the most fierce warriors. The Hunnish state included, in addition to the Mongolian Huns, the indigenous population of the northern Black Sea region. The Huns pitched and drove them westward. The main Hunnish horde stopped between the rivers Danube and Tisa. In this area, for a short time, a strong Hunnic power was formed, with King Attila as its king. After his death in 453, the Hunnic state disintegrated. Part of the Huns settled on the right bank of the Danube, part retreated to the Black Sea steppes. The movement of the Huns to the west of the Volga, along the northern shores of the Black Sea, caused the movement of other tribes. After the Huns, the Bulgars appeared in the Caspian steppes. But the Bulgarians could not hold out too long under the pressure of other nomads. 7. Early feudal states in Transcaucasia. The struggle between Rome and Persia for Armenia and Georgia. The Romans, established in Transcaucasia after the victory over the Armenian king Tigran II, met with strong opposition from the local population. Simultaneously with the Romans, The Parthian kings sought to conquer Transcaucasia. The influence of Rome in the Transcaucasus has become noticeably weaker since the beginning of the 3rd century. NE. At this time in Persia, a strong state was formed under the rule of the local Sassanid dynasty, which destroyed the Parthian kingdom. At the beginning of the IV, the Sassanids subordinated Albania, Azerbaijan, and a significant part of Georgia and Armenia to their power. Only a small part of western Armenia and western Georgia remained under the rule of Rome. At the end of the IV century, the Roman Empire split into 2 parts, the Eastern and the Western. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, continued to struggle with the Persian state for Armenia and Georgia. The emergence of feudal relations in Armenia and Georgia. Around the middle of the 1st century in Armenia, the royal dynasty of the Arsacids was established. The Roman Emperor Nero solemnly received in Rome the Armenian embassy and put the crown on the head of the Armenian king. In the 1st centuries AD, under the kings of the Arsacid dynasty, feudal relations began to take shape in Armenia. The labor of slaves was not very productive. NE. The Mukana Revolt. The most powerful uprising occurred in the 70s of the 8th century. It was called the Insurrection of People in White Shirts, as peasants wore simple white clothes. The leader of the popular uprising was Hashim ibn Hakim, known in the people under the nickname Mukana, which in translation means, under the veil. Mukana in his youth was engaged in washing clothes. During the uprising, he commanded one of the detachments of the rebels. Captured by his enemies, Mukana spent several years in prison. After his escape, he began to prepare a general uprising of the peasants against the landowners and the Arab authorities. The revolt lasted about 7 years. A large number of peasant population of Central Asia took part in it. The rebels captured and destroyed the castles, killed local landowners and exterminated the Arab garrisons in the cities. In order to crush the peasant uprising, the Arab emirs assembled a huge army, supplying it with wall cars. There were several fierce battles in which the peasant army suffered a heavy defeat. However, after the suppression of the Mukana revolt, the people's movements did not cease. The state of the Samanids. With the disintegration of the Arab Caliphate in Central Asia in the second half of the IX, the Tajik state of the Samanids was formed. Tajiks later became known as the indigenous Sogdian population. The kings of the Samanid dynasty, whose capital was the city of Bukhara, tried to create a strong centralized power necessary to fight the nomads. Therefore, the Samanids fought stubbornly against individual rulers striving for independence. Due to the strong power of the Samanids, calmness was established in the Central Asian steppes. This contributed to the flourishing of commerce and city life. The largest cities, Bukhara, Samarkand and Merv, led a lively trade with Eastern and Western countries, including with China and the Volga region. In the era of the Samanids of high development, literature and science have reached. Poets and scientists, philosophers, physicians, geographers, mathematicians, historians, etc., created the richest literature in Arabic and Persian. A number of valuable manuscripts were kept in the palace library in Bukhara. Here at the end of the X century, worked young Avicenna, Ibn Sina, later a famous philosopher, natural scientist and physician. His works were translated into Latin and widely used in medieval Europe. According to Avicenna, in the Samanid library, a special room was assigned to each department of science or literature. The library catalog could quickly find any composition. 9. Khazars and Bulgarians on the Volga. Khazar state on the Volga. In the 7th century, in the lower reaches of the Volga, a strong Khazar power was formed. The Khazars led a semi-nomadic way of life. In the winter they lived in the cities, and in the spring they went out with their herds to the pastures in the steppe. Cattle breeding remained their main occupation, but along with it they engaged in farming and planted vineyards. The Khazars still retained the division into genera, each of which owned a separate piece of land. But the clan system was already decaying. Of the genera, An influential stratum of the tribal nobility emerged. At the head of the Khazar power was the Khagan, Tsar, surrounded by rich dignitaries. The king was given divine honors, but the state was not ruled by the Khagan himself, but by his governor. Khagan lived in Itil, located near the mouth of the Volga. It was a large and crowded city, stretched on both banks of the Volga's branches. Behind the wall surrounding the city, there were wooden houses and felt yurts. On the island, which was connected to the shore by means of a floating bridge, the palace of the Khagan was built of bricks. The eastern part of the city was inhabited by visiting merchants, Arabs, Greeks, Jews, Khwarezmians, etc. There were many bazaars on which various goods of Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Volga region and the Slav lands could be found. Itil was the largest center of southeast trade. Of particular importance to him was trade with Khwarezm. The Khazars took duty from merchants. It was one of the most important revenues of the Tsarist treasury. Constant communication with the more cultured peoples of the East had a great influence on the structure of the Khazar power and on the way of life of its population. The dominant layer of the Khazars, together with the Khagan, accepted the Jewish religion. Another significant Khazar city was Sarkal on the Don. Sarkal was built with the participation of Byzantine engineers and was supposed to protect the country from invasions of nomads. The Khazar power reached its greatest power in the 9th century. In the south, the Khazars, in alliance with Byzantium, fought with the Arabs and reached even the Araks River. To the west of the Volga, Khazars belonged to the lands between the Caspian and Azov seas. At one time they subjugated part of the Crimea and paid tribute to the Slavic tribes that lived along the Dnieper and the Oka. In the north, the power of the Khazars stretched to the middle Volga. The nearest neighbors of the Khazars were the Pechnegs, who in the 9th century wandered between the river Yaik, the Urals and the Volga. In the second half of the same century, under the pressure of other nomadic tribes, as well as the Khazars, the Pechnegs moved farther west and occupied the steppes between the Don and the Dnieper. The Bulgarian state on the Volga and Kama. The union of Bulgarian tribes disintegrated under the blows of other nomads. Some Bulgarians left for the Danube. Here the Bulgarians were absorbed by the Slavs, but gave them their tribal name. Another part of the Bulgarians went up along the Volga and in the lands located on the lower reaches of the Kama and on the middle Volga, forming an independent state. During the resettlement on the Kama and Volga, the Bulgarians were still nomads. In the occupied lands, they conquered the local population engaged in farming and cattle breeding. In new places, the Bulgarians switched to agriculture. According to the stories of Arab writers, the Bulgarians sowed wheat, barley and millet. In the Bulgarian state power belonged to the Tsar, tribal princes and tribal nobility. Most of the cities were located near the confluence of Kama with the Volga. The capital of the Bulgarians, located on the Volga, the Arabs called the Great City. Merchants from the Slavic lands and from Central Asia came to the capital of Bulgaria every year. From the Slavic lands brought strong, slender slaves and valuable furs. Arab merchants came with bulat swords, silk and paper fabrics and various expensive ornaments. Bulgarians themselves went for furs to the north, which they called a country of darkness. With the hunters of this country, they led a barter trade. The Bulgarian merchants laid out the goods brought in a certain place and then retired. The next day they found the skins of animals near their goods. If the merchant was satisfied, he took the fur, and left his goods in place. Otherwise, he did not touch the fur and took back his goods. Together with the Eastern trade, a higher Arab culture penetrated the Bulgarian state. Already in the X century, the dominant stratum of the Bulgarian population borrowed Islam from the Arabs. Imitating the Arabs, the Bulgarians began to mint their own coins. In the early X century, Bulgaria visited as part of the Arab embassy of Ibn Fadlan, who left a very interesting description of his trip. King of Bulgarians met ambassadors not far from the capital. Then the ambassadors were received in a large, richly tidy yurt, on the floor of which lay Armenian carpets. The king was sitting on a throne covered with Byzantine brocade. On the right side of him sat the tribal chiefs. During the feast, guests were treated to pieces of meat and a drink from honey. Ibn Fadlan saw Russian merchants arrived. They were strong, slender people. Each of them was armed with an axe, a knife and a sword, which he never parted with. When the rich Russian was dying, his corpse was put in a boat, pulled out on land, filled it with things of the deceased, weapons, various products, and sacrificed by horses. On the day of the funeral, one of the slave girls was killed, and the rook with all the things, the deceased and the murdered girl, was burned. After the formation of the Bulgarian and Khazar states, the Volga became very important in trade relations between Asia and Europe. With its upper reaches, the Volga approaches the western Dvina, which flows into the Baltic Sea. Due to this, an almost continuous river route from the Caspian to the Baltic Sea and back was established. Between the rivers, the boats were transported by drag. In the 8th centuries, Arab merchants traveled in large numbers to trade along the Volga. For the goods they took, they paid small silver coins, called dirham. The dirhams then dispersed throughout Eastern Europe, fell into the Baltic states, Scandinavia, and even Germany. Thus, in the 8th centuries, Eastern Europe was drawn into trade relations with the East and the West.